Hello and welcome back. This is a discussion of the Crusades for Rise of Europe at Lee University with Dr. Schlosser. The Crusades are a popular series of movements that most of us are probably familiar with, at least in passing. But I think it's helpful to take a step back and look at the Crusades more broadly, especially in sort of the origins of the Crusades and how something like this could happen when it does. And not at another time. But then also to see the movement as it sort of evolves over time and becomes different than maybe what it had originally been meant to do in the first place. So if we look at the origins of the Crusade, how this could have happened when it does. The First Crusade is called at the end of the 11th century in 1095. Why does it happen in the 11th century and not before? Jerusalem had been in the hands of Muslims for 400 years. There was ample time for Christian Latin Europeans to come and try to reclaim the Holy City. But it doesn't happen until 1095, and so we have to ask why. And there are a series of reasons that play into this. There's a lot going on that happens in the 11th century that makes it possible at the end of the century to go and reclaim Jerusalem, or even conceivable, something that perhaps Western Europeans hadn't even considered in the previous centuries. So what are some of these factors that play into this? Well, the first is something that we haven't had a lot of time in this class to discuss, but I have mentioned that here during the Central Middle Ages, the church as an institution is becoming more reformed. That is to say, it's becoming centralized, it's becoming hierarchical. The Bishop of Rome is becoming more and more important in the West as the leading religious figure. It's becoming more standardized. It becomes possible at the end of the 1000s for the Bishop of Rome to call all Western European Christians to action in ways that maybe he wouldn't have had the authority to do in generations or centuries past. Similarly, there's a rise in popular piety here in the Central Middle Ages. That is to say, average lay people not working in the church, grow in. There's a popular piety movement. People are experiencing Christianity perhaps in more spiritual, emotional ways than they had in the past. Some of this might be related to that idea of millenarianism, where the idea that the turn of the millennium has significant spiritual consequences. There's a lot of different factors that play into it, but it makes it possible so that when the Bishop of Rome makes a call to play into the passions and the emotions and the sensibilities of the common people, they're much more interested to devote literally their lives to a religious cause. And then also there's a rise in pilgrimage and the possibility for pilgrimage here in the 11th century. Now, pilgrimage had been something that Christians had been doing for centuries at this point, and that's nothing new. But what is different or new here in the 11th century is the possibility of going on longer pilgrimages or more important pilgrimages. People had traveled to Rome or maybe even Jerusalem in the past, but it's expensive and only the most powerful or the most wealthy could afford it. Well, here during the Central Middle Ages, we have increased trading networks, we have increased long-distance networks of travel. It's just easier to travel longer distances. We have an increase in economy where more people could afford it. And so these things together allow for something like the Crusades to happen here at the end of the 11th century. The impetus for the Crusades originally begins outside of Europe. It actually comes from the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire here at the end of the 11th century was in a bit of a crisis. There were invasions from a Muslim Turkish group, the Seljuk Turks, coming into Asia Minor. You can see this map here in the incursion lines of the Turks invading Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. And the Byzantine Empire was also exhausted from war with other groups, including Western Europeans, people like the Normans in southern Italy. So when the emperor does call for help from the West, he's asking for help from those people who know how to fight. Those are those landed aristocratic elites, the bellatores, those people who have trained all their lives to fight, the knights. There's another reason that, from the Byzantine perspective, it seems like potentially a good idea to ask for help from the West, and this is the idea of reconciling with the West religiously. We've skipped over this, but it's right around this time that you have the schism in the church. This is the separation between the Eastern Christian Church and the Western Christian Church. This happens in the 1050s, not that long before, just a generation before. And we can say from our perspective that this becomes permanent, or at least it has been for the last 1,000 years. But people here at the end of the 11th century had no way of knowing this. And so potentially the emperor is hoping with aid from the West, the Christian church could be reunited into one whole church. And so Alexis Comnena, the Byzantine emperor, sends a request to the West through the Pope to gain aid, to have these Latin knights come help the Byzantines against the invading Turks. And so the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who receives this call is Urban II. You'll notice here he's noted as the legitimate successor to another Pope, Gregory VII. This gets into a little bit more detail than what we need for our purposes here today, but understand this comes out of that reform movement. Gregory VII in the 1000s is a major reform leader in the church. He does much to solidify the position of the Bishop of Rome, the authority of the Bishop of Rome, the centralization, standardization of the church. And so Urban comes out of that, and he continues this reforming legacy. And so he calls the Council of Clermont in 1095, and this is a famous call for crusade. It's sort of a well-known piece of oratory and rhetoric, often seen as in textbooks as an example of Western rhetoric and speech-making. But you'll also notice that Urban adds on to the call that Alexis had given him. That is to say, from the very beginning, already, when this is transmitted from the Byzantines to the Pope, and then from the Pope to the European peoples, it's like a game of telephone, and this changes over time. So notice that Alexis Comnena, the Byzantine emperor, had wanted help against the Turks in Asia Minor, and Urban goes ahead to add on and says, why don't you go ahead and reclaim Jerusalem? You're not that far away. You're in sort of the neighborhood anyway. Why don't you continue on as if in pilgrimage and reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom? So already it's beginning to change. And then also notice that he adds on this idea of a crusading indulgence. And this sort of indulgence is perhaps different than what Protestants might be used to thinking about with the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther and all of those sorts of things. But the idea here is that if someone were to die in battle going on crusade, sort of this holy warfare fighting against the infidel, regardless of what that person had done, regardless of what their sins had been, regardless of what that person had believed, regardless of any of those circumstances, someone who dies in holy combat fighting the infidels on crusade would go straight to heaven. There's no stopping it go. There's no collecting $200. It's a straight to heaven, automatic pass. And this is something new. This is something different that Urban adds on here. And so Alexis, the Byzantine emperor, had wanted those Latin knights, but those are not the first people who show up. The first people who arrive at Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, are the People's Crusade. These are farmers, they're peasants. They're not knights, they're not trained in warfare or combat. They don't have traditional weapons. They're carrying whatever sharp objects may have been at hand. Pitchforks and scythes and maybe whatever other farming implements they could have grabbed hold of on their way out. These are not the people Alexis had wanted. And it's largely a group of rabble. Right? There's a lot of people here. They're draining the resources of the empire. They're camping outside the city walls of Constantinople. Alexis doesn't really know what to do with them. So he says, all right, you want to fight the Muslims? There's a group over across the Bosphorus Straits. I'll ferry you over there. Good luck. And he sort of washes his hands of them, and they all die. It's a disaster. When finally the real Crusaders show up, those knights that Alexis had wanted in the first place, Alexis makes them swear a feudal oath. This is that relationship, that feudal relationship between lord and vassal. And the idea here, remember, Alexis has called these Crusaders to come over to help reclaim land for the empire. And so the idea is that any land that they reclaim is being reclaimed for the empire, and they will become feudal vassals of the Eastern Emperor. And the Crusaders, these knights, all sort of smile and nod and swear the oaths and say, yes, sure, of course, Emperor, whatever you say, with sort of the understanding that they're doing this with their hands behind their backs and their fingers crossed, with no real intention of following through with this anyway. When we look at these accounts, when we look at these interactions, one of our sources that tells us about this comes from the emperor's daughter, Anna. And as she talks about these Crusaders, she refers to them as the Franks, and that's kind of a catch-all term. Anybody from Western Europe was often referred to as the Franks. But they're also seen as barbarous. Anna sees them as uncouth and unclean and uncultured and uncivilized. And so even though part of the rationale for asking for help from the West was to try to reconcile the Eastern Christian Church and the Western Christian Church, you can see that these two groups are not really getting along from the beginning at all. So after swearing these oaths that the Crusaders have no intention of keeping, they continue on, and they have some success against the Turks in Asia Minor, the people they're supposed to be fighting for. But then they continue on towards Jerusalem, this kind of extra goal that Urban had added on. And they get stuck outside the city of Antioch. Antioch is kind of there at the corner of the Mediterranean where modern-day Turkey and Syria meet. And they get stuck sieging the city for a long, long time, and they're not really having much success there. Until eventually one of the Crusaders, the story goes, has this vision where one of the apostles appears to him, and the Crusader finds the Holy Lance. This is that spear that the centurion uses to stab the side of Christ, the account of the crucifixion. It's a holy relic. It's a relic from one of the most holy stories of the Christian faith. This rallies the troops. It boosts their morale. They all rush forward and surge into the city and take the city of Antioch. And so they continue from there down towards Jerusalem, but they're wholly unprepared for the climate that they'll meet there. Remember, these are knights from Western Europe. They're used to fighting in the cold, wet climates of France and England, and they have on their full, heavy metal suits of armor, and they're marching through the dry, hot deserts of the Near East. And so they run out of food. There are accounts of cannibalism. Things are not looking good. And so eventually when they arrive at Jerusalem and take the city in 1099, they take it in a quite ruthless manner. Our accounts talk about the streets running with blood, and the Crusaders are rather indiscriminate about who they kill in the process of taking the city. They're fighting against Muslims. That makes sense. But we should note that the Muslims they're fighting when they take the city of Jerusalem are not the Turks. They're not the Seljuk Turks, the people that they had been called to fight against in the first place. These are Muslims who aren't even allied or have a relationship with the Seljuk Turks. It's a different group of people. So the Muslims that they kill are not the Muslims they're supposed to be killing in the first place. There are Jews in the city that the Crusaders kill. There are Christians in the city that the Crusaders kill, but they are not Latin Christians, they're not Western Christians. The Crusaders see them as heretics, and so it doesn't really matter. Women and children and kind of anybody who gets in their way of taking the city is pretty much put to the sword. And it's one of the more brutal, bloody, really tough sackings of a city. Sackings of cities are never, nice and clean. This one particularly seems to take that to the next level. So already we're seeing in the very first crusade an evolution of this idea from the call that the Byzantine emperor put out to the Pope, and then from the Pope to the people, and as the European crusaders are going out on a crusade and kind of making it their own thing, it's becoming something different. And we'll see this around Europe, not just in attempts to reclaim the Holy Land, but in other places too. So, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula, Christians will be fighting Muslims in this process called the Reconquista, or the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. We should note that this is a very long process. It begins before the Crusades, even as early as the 700s, a century when the Muslims come into Spain, and it will even go beyond the sort of official crusading movement. But during this period that the Crusades are happening, the language of the Crusades, the rhetoric, the ideas, the mentalities are incorporated into the way that Christians and Muslims are interacting with each other here in Iberia. That's modern-day Spain and Portugal. We can see that in the Song of Roland, a book that we're reading in this class here at the same time. And even in the 1200s, there's an official crusade called against the Muslims in Spain by the Pope Innocent III. Innocent is a figure that we'll come back to again. But this is on the other end of the Mediterranean. This has nothing to do with the Holy Land, and yet crusading rhetoric, crusading ideas, and even at one point an official crusade is mixed up in this idea of the Reconquista. I won't say much about this particular slide. This has to do with European Christians pushing outward in northern and central Europe, in areas around modern-day Germany, and into the Slavic lands. This idea, the Drang nach Osten, literally just means the push to the east, or the drive to the east. And the idea here is the same as we've already been seeing in Iberia, in the Holy Land. There's a movement of European Christians to push outward to bring ideas of Latin Christianity, Latin European Christianity with them. And as in Iberia, largely this is a rather violent interaction, and those who do not accept the European Christian way of life will often be met with forcible conversion or perhaps even death. And so here in the Central Middle Ages, we see a shift from the defensive mentality of the earlier centuries, times like when Europeans were facing invasions from people like the Vikings or the Magyars, and how those people assimilated into European culture. Now European Christians are pushing more outward in an offensive way, and taking their sense of identity, their Christian, Latin, European sense, with them. And this is a very stark black and white contrast, and often this is not just true of the people of this period, but this is a way that a lot of people think about themselves and form their identity. A lot of times we think about the way we identify ourselves as in contrast to what we are not. So these Europeans are thinking of themselves as not Muslim, not pagan, not a number of other things. And so people who don't fit into the European identity are often marginalized and pushed out, often in a hostile kind of way, and excluded from social and economic and religious communities. People like Muslims, who we've been talking about, people like Jews who occupy a ambiguous space in medieval European society, people like lepers who bring a physical and psychological threat to the community. This is seen around the frontiers, the borders of Europe, but even within communities within Europe as well, this marginalization happens. That's largely what I wanted to say about the Crusades for today. I hope that this video has been helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Be happy to address any of those. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks so much.